The numbers look pretty good for Lando Norris at the start of 2025. A win, a second place from the first two races, and an 8-point lead in the World Championship. But beyond those headline numbers, it's looked like a less than comfortable, maybe even tricky start for Norris. Scott, how convinced have you been by what we've seen from Norris so far in terms of his credibility as a championship leader and title contender?
Well, the peaks are exactly where you'd need them to be when you're looking at what Norris can do in the McLaren. And actually, I think for the most part, it has been very good. Melbourne was an excellent weekend. Obviously, he slid off on slicks when the rain came there, but he was the first on the scene. So I think you always have to get a little bit of a free pass when that happens.
Agreed.
Less so with the mistake that put him under pressure at the end of that race from Max Verstappen, because it should have been nice and comfortable, should have had Verstappen at arm's length. And there was that little bit of doubt that we had a couple of times last year that Norris can sometimes make those tiny little errors unprompted, make life a little bit tougher for himself than needed. And then obviously errors over the China weekend. He was berating himself quite a lot on Friday after sprint qualifying in particular, not hooking up laps on Friday or Saturday when it counted. Kind of got where he needed to be by the end of the weekend, but not enough to offset the fact that Oscar Piastri had got the better of him in China. So one of those starts where points-wise, he'll be really, really happy. And the fact that he hasn't got it completely right and has this lead reflects very well on Norris. But it's just, it depends on whether or not those sort of weak points become kind of thematic over the course of the year, or if he's kind of got that difficulty out of the way early.
Yeah, it's obviously a bit too soon to get the pattern. But my read on Melbourne, it reminded me of watching Damon Hill in the Williams in the mid-90s. You know, Norris is the Hill in that scenario. Verstappen is the Michael Schumacher in the kind of Ferrari that's not really quick enough to be a title contender, but he's always kind of there sniping away. And for him to get so close to beating Norris in Melbourne, I thought that was kind of Norris getting away with one a little bit. And I felt the same in China, but for different reasons, because obviously in China, Red Bull were not really in contention. Verstappen was saying maybe that was the fourth fastest car, or even slower than the junior team Racing Bull's car. Ferrari did their best to implode after a really impressive sprint, and that kind of gave Norris a free pass almost, because he was really messy on the Saturday, and then overall overshadowed by teammate Oscar Piastri. So even though the points are really good, I'm again kind of getting that feeling from the sort of middle of last year when Norris was a title contender and Piastri seemed like the more convincing McLaren driver. We've kind of started in that position where Norris isn't a step ahead of his teammate, really.
I would also say that, I'd never go as far as to say, Norris is being outright petulant over the radio or after sessions with what he's saying, but there's a dash of entitlement sometimes with the way that his immediate reaction is to say, the car's too tricky, or I've been saying all along that the car does this. And there was that radio message, wasn't there, in China, where he said, well, I'm going to need some help then, or I need some help then, yes, don't I? Or however it was phrased, where it was a little bit like, well, I'm doing everything I can, why aren't you doing more to help me? And look, every driver does that to a degree. And I think there's almost a little bit of a very, like, a great driver trait in that, where you just kind of have to have this like pressure relief valve basically that you open up over the radio. But the main thing is you kind of do need to be an all-time great to get away with it if you do it lots. And so far the success and results aren't quite on Norris's side in terms of actually doing that. I think once he kind of steps away from it, he does take accountability for those moments where he just doesn't hook it up. He's one of the most self-critical drivers on the grid. But every now and again, especially in China, because obviously Australia, the results did go his way. China, there was a little bit of that creeping in where it felt a little bit like, is he kind of overwhelming himself just a tiny bit in terms of the frustration at not hooking it up? Is he lashing out just a smidge? It's nothing absolutely disastrous. It's just something that when you compare it to Piastri, for example, who, like, I feel like the whole world could collapse around him and he wouldn't complain about it over the radio.
Yeah, he's certainly much more sort of even-keeled, shall we say. I think Norris was quite fortunate the way the Chinese Grand Prix kind of came to him, because, okay, he was also lucky in that he survived the brake issue and managed to get to the end. That could have been disastrous, so we might be talking about something quite different. But in terms of the way that race played out, he looked quite strong in second place and just paid the price for qualifying. But he was much stronger than the day before, and that's the bit I want to drill into, that Saturday discomfort that led to that kind of slightly petulant attitude on the radio you mentioned. He was again, quite forthright out of the car, saying there was too much understeer in the car on the Saturday. And he says basically, I can't drive an F1 car when it's got understeer. I mean, I don't think really there are any drivers who love understeer. There are obviously some who do better with it than others. And Norris would not put himself in that camp. So what is it about the way the McLaren behaves so far this season, and particularly in China, that just isn't gelling with Norris's driving style?
Yes, I say there are two kind of distinct things, but they do essentially relate to Norris's driving style and the way that he wants to kind of load the car up a little bit more on entry, roll the speed through the corner, which asks more of the car platform and also more of the tyres through the corner with a higher minimum speed. It's the U shape of a corner versus a V shape is kind of how you'll conventionally hear it described. And basically, as I say, there are two things this stresses. It's the behaviour of the tyre and the behaviour of the car. From a tyre point of view, in China, for example, that is a front-limited circuit. It asks an awful lot of the front tyres, the front left in particular. That's why it's a race where you often see a lot of graining. And actually, in the past, Norris has admitted he struggles with graining. Las Vegas last year, I think, was another one because he's using the tyres more aggressively. So there's a natural driving style element there that meant Norris was harder on his tyres, on his fronts, than Piastri was, which causes a little bit of a weakness perhaps over one lap in terms of hooking it up, but over a stint it's particularly damaging as well. But the second part of it is what that driving style asks of the car. As I say, you you put more on the car into the corner and through the corner, you're slightly more susceptible to that car biting back. Okay, if he doesn't have the initial grip to start with, if there's that little bit of understeer, then that's a problem because he won't be able to get the car in at the speed he wants to take into the corner. But the second part of it is you just have the car more on the knife edge because you're going faster through the corner. Whereas Piastri, I think, when he gets the rotation maybe a little later, and maybe it's a little bit more of an aggressive rotation further into the corner, but everything's happening with the car sort of loaded up less to begin with, so it doesn't snap as badly. And this McLaren does bite back. We've been saying that since pre-season testing. And I think Andrea Stella put it quite well in China. He thinks that basically Norris is realising that with this car, he will be more effective when Norris is driving at 99%, because when Norris tries to go to 100%, the way Stella described it is things trip over a little bit.
Is this what was happening at the hairpin then? Because that seemed to be the real weak spot for Norris in China. If you overlay even their Grand Prix qualifying laps where Norris was a bit tidier, it looked like Piastri had a proper advantage there where he was able to brake later, get the car stopped, rotated that much quicker, and then losing a little bit on the exit, but overall gaining more than on the way in than he was losing on the way out. Is that a particular area where Norris, even though he's obviously trying to adapt and move more to the way his teammates driving for that particular circumstance, it's just not quite coming together for him?
It's tricky because obviously that's a good example of that corner comes very late in the lap. So you've asked a lot of the tyres by that point. The fronts are probably screaming enough. And if he's just trying to get that little bit more out of it, then it's going to be a bit of a struggle. But I think he'd also been weaker at that corner through the weekend. So he was then chasing a little bit more. We actually did see this for the first time 2 years ago at the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, which I think was the second round of the season. So Piastri's second ever F1 race. And Piastri had actually been quicker at the final corner in Saudi the whole weekend up to that point. And you remember, you might remember that Norris hit the wall on the inside. Just slightly. And that was felt at the time to be a reaction to the fact that Piastri had been quicker than him there the whole weekend, and Norris was just chasing it a little bit. Some similarities there with China, a hairpin late in the lap, where Piastri's just inherently stronger. Norris is chasing a little bit more. It doesn't quite hook up. He's trying to make it happen rather than it happen naturally, and it just doesn't quite work out. And we're talking about absolutely utterly fine margins here, even by F1 standards. It's hundredths of a second between the two McLaren drivers so far in qualifying this year. So yeah, you've got Norris chasing things just a little bit, and a lot of the time over the course of this year, I'm sure it's absolutely going to work out for him, but there are moments where I think it stresses him a little bit too far, and then in turn his driving style stresses the car too far.
There was another aspect of the lap in China that I felt really suited Piastri too, and he just seemed to have that slight edge in the high speed, that kind of middle part of the lap where they go through the kind of long arcing, I think it's turn 7, that quick left-hander. He seemed to be a little bit more confident there, able to keep the throttle nailed in a way Norris couldn't. So there's maybe a few sort of hints of Piastri taking a step, and it's interesting that he's flipped the dynamic from the very end of last season, where Norris was out of title contention and seemed to be freed up from the pressure of chasing Max Verstappen, and looked to me to be half a step ahead of Piastri, basically right to the end of the season. This year, if you take that kind of end of the first stint in Australia where Norris was under pressure from Piastri and McLaren basically had to call him off, and then pretty much the whole of the Chinese Grand Prix weekend, which was in Piastri's favour, he started really strongly. It looks like he's taken that step. And given the circumstances at the front where, as we said before, Verstappen's basically out of the picture while Red Bull's kind of in a mess with its car. George Russell's driving really well, but question marks over whether the Mercedes is quite there and able to do it race after race. Obviously, Ferrari are doing their best to do Ferrari things and take Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton completely out of the equation. So is Piastri basically Norris's biggest threat in this World Championship now?
I think at the moment he is, because McLaren does look like it has an edge. It's executing weekends well. It has the fastest car over one lap, and it has an edge in most conditions in the race. We've seen a couple of hints that, when the Ferrari's hooked up, it can be quick. Verstappen at the end of the Grand Prix looked pretty competitive as well in that tricky Red Bull. But Piastri's in the same car as Norris. So if Norris is going to be fighting for the World Championship to the end of the year, Piastri is the first rival that Norris will have to beat. And I do think Piastri has stepped up really well at the start of this year, both in terms of one lap pace in qualifying, which was the most obvious area in which he was weak compared to Norris last year, but also in terms of race management. That's tyre usage, race pace, also little bits of racecraft. Andrea Stella said that Piastri's also improved a little bit in terms of reading the race and sort of judging what to ask and when to ask it, when he needs certain pieces of information. But that pace element is absolutely critical. Well, obviously, it manifested itself in his first pole in China, which is a great halo example of it. But if you look at it, it wasn't just China, because Stella said that previously last year, before the safety car where Piastri picked up some damage, so the final race result was even worse than it actually should have been. He was already half a minute adrift of Norris. He was all at sea in China last year, but he was also pretty underwhelming or unspectacular in Melbourne as well. Melbourne, the first 2 years, he was a quarter of a second off Norris in qualifying. This year, he's within a tenth. In China last year, the first time that they were there, he was a tenth. I think he was a tenth slower than Norris. This year, obviously, he was quicker. So he's turned it around in qualifying. It's very early. It's a small sample set to go with, but it does look like he's taken that step in qualifying. And then the race performances are so much better. Instead of being 20, 30 seconds adrift of Norris in the races that don't quite come together for Piastri, he's absolutely right there. He's either hounding Norris like he was in Australia, or he can lead from the front like he was in China. And coming back to Norris, I think that's a really significant factor, because not only does Norris have things that he needs to get on top of in the McLaren, that pressure from below or that pressure from the side, because it's in the same garage, is only increasing from Piastri.